Like and subscribe, join the Discord, the Minecraft server, the Patreon, and check out the Instagram. Now let's dive. According to the mainstream media narrative, on September the 25th of 2017, Stephen Paddock would arrive at the MGM Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino to enjoy some gambling and the music festival that coincided with his trip. And it seems that his trip had been going very well for him. Employees report Stephen being deeply engrossed in his gambling, even sometimes using 2 and 3 video slot machines simultaneously. However, it seems something went deeply wrong because on the 7th day of his stay, or more precisely, on October the 1st of 2017, 64-year-old Stephen Paddock would break open the hurricane-proof windows of his 32nd story, 1,700 square foot hotel room with a tiny hammer, and fortunately for him, no alarms were triggered in this process, and he had time to scope in his 24 rifles and ensure that everything was prepared for what happened next. At 9:59 p.m. that night, a security guard walks near Stephen's room, where the door is allegedly open, and then is shot in the leg. The guard's name is Jesus Campos, however, he doesn't report his wound. According to most mainstream media reporting, 6 minutes later, at 10:05 p.m., Stephen began firing into the crowd of concert goers at the Route 91 Harvest Festival, which was taking place beneath his hotel room. In just about 10 minutes on the dot, Stephen fired somewhere between 1,000 and 1,100 rounds into the crowd, which was anywhere from 1,100 feet to over 2,000 feet away from him and 32 stories below his room. Stephen struck and killed 58 people that day with his gunfire, in addition to injuring roughly 450 others with his bullets. But the panic he caused resulted in an additional 400 or so injuries. And that for most is where the story ends. The media never bothered to investigate, the FBI and police never give a motive, or really much information whatsoever. And as we sit today, the lives of thousands have been irreversibly damaged, and for some destroyed because of the acts of, supposedly, one man. Or so we're told. I want to get into what really happened, but first, I just gotta say the mainstream slop narrative frustrates the actual crap out of me, because by not investigating what really happened that night, they're leaving these hundreds of people and their families to be left without the answers that they deserve. So truly I pray that for all the people who passed away that night, that God holds their souls near to him and his son for all eternity. Amen. That being said, let's figure out what actually happened that night and bring justice for all these people who truly deserve it. Firstly, when I set out to explain this mystery, I tried to do it in one video, but I realized that would be a 3-hour long video, so we're going to start with the absolute basics and fundamentals of what's wrong with this story. And to do that, we're going to start with Stephen Paddock himself, and all the things wrong with him as the alleged shooter. According to mainstream sources, you would basically learn that Stephen was just some random dude we know basically nothing about. We know that he liked to gamble though, and he might have been mad at the casinos and that's why he shot him up, which is absolute bogus and a disrespect to journalism. So let's go a little bit deeper than that. Stephen Paddock was born in Clinton, Iowa on April the 9th of 1953. His mother's name was Dolores, and she by all accounts was a good woman who sought to protect and nurture her children. His father was named Benjamin Hoskins Paddock, and he was quite the opposite of Stephen's mother. He was what one could easily call a deadbeat, but more so than most degenerate dads. Rather than going out to get the milk and never returning, Stephen's dad went out and robbed banks, only to never return. Benjamin was arrested in 1960 and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He, however, would only serve 8 of those years, escaping the federal penitentiary in the dead of winter on December 30th of 1968. Shortly thereafter, he was placed on the FBI top 10 most wanted list for 8 consecutive years, which put him at around 11th or 12th for the longest time ever spent on the FBI top 10. During this time after his escape, Paddock's father would go on to commit several other crimes, including racketeering. Indeed, it seemed to have worked out for him, as he would die in 1998 at the age of 71. Cooper, you might say, this is interesting, I haven't heard this, but what does this have to do with Stephen except for give us the idea that he might have had some daddy issues? And as we stand, that's a valid question. And I'm going to follow it up by saying that Stephen Paddock was much like his father, and he was a criminal. But he wasn't just your typical run-of-the-mill bank robber like his dad. Stephen Paddock was a covert arms dealer. Now that's going to be a wacky claim to you right now, but I promise you, we have the evidence to back it up. And throughout this entire series, we're going to reference back to this point quite a few times, and you'll be surprised that there's a lot more evidence for it than you might expect. So hang on, strap in, let's do this. Firstly, Stephen is the oldest child, whose siblings would describe him as the most boring and the only one who wasn't really affected by anger issues in the family. From childhood, Stephen seemed the most set on a regular life, and by all appearances, he would end up having anything but. Stephen's life history is about as clear as sticking a magnifying glass in the mud, but we do know some very key points. At the age of 22, which is in the mid-1970s, Stephen gets a job as a postal worker and continues doing so for several years until the age of 25, at which point he disappears from all known accounts for about a year and then resurfaces with a job at the IRS. And from what we know, Stephen stayed at the IRS until 1984, spending his time auditing defense contractors. I think defense is a pretty bogus name for what they actually do. Defense contractors are the companies that make weapons of war, armor, planes, helicopters, you name it. The last of which is a very key factor later in this mystery. And then after this, Stephen drops off the map once more, only to reappear on an employee list for the company that would later become Lockheed Martin, where he then proceeds to spend the next several years of his life doing what are known as internal audits. And it's worth noting that Lockheed Martin is one of the largest war contractors on Earth. Now, it's already suspicious that Stephen went from auditing weapons companies to working for these same weapons companies. That's what we would often call a conflict of interest. And it's super strange too, considering that Stephen had neither a mathematics or finance degree, and supremely strange because he should never have gotten a job within the government or one of these companies whatsoever. The feds are very particular about who they allow into their inner sanctum. Your background, family background, browser history, closet, all must be clean as a whistle. If there's even a tiny spot or the smallest red flag, you're out of there. So how then did an unqualified random dude working in the postal service, whose father was one of the most wanted criminals on Earth for over a decade, get anywhere near a government office involved in the transfer of hundreds of billions of dollars and the receipt of the most advanced weaponry on Earth, as well as incredibly important top secret government and business information? Something here doesn't add up. And we're going to get confirmation of this in the following strange detail about Stephen. The last employment records for Stephen Paddock end in the late 1980s, meaning that for roughly 40 years the man didn't work a job of perceivably any kind. But even stranger, in this 40-year period, Stephen accumulated enough wealth to acquire millions of dollars of investment properties and apartment buildings, with one alone generating him over $500,000 a year. In addition to this, Stephen was a highly proficient pilot who owned 2 planes that he flew wherever and whenever he desired. And if that isn't weird enough, despite what reports say, there are no existing records from the IRS of these properties being purchased, and the sites that I found that claimed to have such proof had nothing of the sort. But to add the cherry on top to this story, when one neighbor asked Stephen what he did, Stephen reported that he was a professional gambler. And according to the IRS, Stephen reported on his taxes that he had earned $5 million while gambling the year prior to the shooting. Which, let's just take a pause. I mean, if he did that, why would Stephen need to shoot up anything? He's clearly a master at his craft. And as it turns out, that 5 million number really isn't the truth, and there's a good reason why it's such a red flag. Winning $5 million in gambling is nearly impossible unless you are going to spend many millions more to do so. Meaning you are technically spending money to lose money that technically on your gambler's tax form counts as winning, which obviously almost no one would want to do. But that sounds a little bit convoluted, so let's try and get a better understanding of what that really means. To get into the mindset, Stephen was considered a high roller at the Mandalay Bay, but also at just about every casino in Vegas. He was a guy who would come in, drop tons of money gambling, and leave. He was what you would call a reliable customer who you could always make money off of. And this is especially true at the Mandalay Bay, where Stephen was known by everyone who worked there. Indeed, Stephen spent so much time there at the casino that employees knew him on a first-name basis and would come up and say hello to him when they saw him. And we can even see an example of that on video. By all accounts, Stephen was well liked because he was just a nice guy, and by the casino, obviously because he was willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars gambling. So much so that the Mandalay Bay and other casinos would send him gifts and free travel and plane tickets and experiences and hotel rooms just to get him to come back to their casino where he would continue spending money. And this is important because casinos wouldn't engage in this sort of behavior for someone who had won $5 million off of them. In fact, that's the sort of fellow you would never want walking into your casino again because you just lost $5 million. And below, I'm going to link an article that I found while researching that details just exactly how impossible this 5 million number is and what the real likely answer behind it really might be. Essentially, we know that in order to win $5 million, Stephen's gross earnings would have had to have been something closer to $48 million, which makes no sense, especially considering the max bet on a virtual slot machine is $125 per hand, which would require Stephen to have spent all day every day for months straight just pulling levers time and time again. We won't dive too deep into the math because I don't want to bore you, so let's continue. The virtual slot machine, which is the only recorded gambling we have of Stephen Paddock, is a very interesting and unique beast in Las Vegas. Casinos are required to fill out certain tax forms when a player wins a certain amount of money. Depending on the machine, it's higher or lower, and if it's what you would call a card game like poker, then you don't have to fill out any form if the player wins something, even if the player won millions of dollars. to my knowledge. But on the virtual slot machine specifically, a casino has to fill out what is called a W2G form for every time a player in a single hand wins over $1,200, which is kind of like a gambler's tax form to confirm that this player did in fact win the money at the casino. Which, as I found out, is extremely unlikely in this game. Keeping that in mind for a second, virtual slot machines are also known for having what's called a 99% payback rate, or play table, and because of that, you are almost guaranteed to always win almost all of your money back. For instance, if I made a $100 bet on this machine, I'm very likely to get $99 back, especially if I'm experienced. But at the very least, it'll probably be like 94%, and at the very most, it'll be 99%, meaning that the casino takes anywhere from $1 to $6 on average per turn. Okay. Keeping that in mind as well, the odds of Steven winning over $1,200 on a single hand are about 0.4%, so incredibly unlikely. And all this is to say that while Steven is constantly playing these games and pulling these levers, he's just losing money. Straight up, there's no other way around it. And based on this research this article did, what actually happened most likely is that Steven spent about $5.4 million gambling in that previous year in order to win $5 million gambling as reported by the IRS. Therefore, what likely happened with this $5 million number we hear about from the IRS is that Steven did technically win $5 million, but according to the most accurate math I could find, he would have had to have spent $5,404,933 to do so. So yes, on your tax form, he did win $5 million, but at a $5.4 million loss. Obviously a terrible deal. Losing 400 grand is ridiculous for just about anybody on earth. However, it's about to give us a bunch of information we were not expecting, and it gives us two fascinating questions and rabbit holes to go down. The first and most obvious question is, where did this $5 million come from? I don't know about you, but the last time I walked down the street, I didn't just see a pallet of hundreds lying there and pick it up and put it in my pocket. And according to Steven's finances and work history, this is exactly what we're led to believe. He's acquired tens of millions of dollars over his lifetime from nothing. Also has an incredibly advanced real estate portfolio, and has enough free cash to make a prince blush, taking his baby mama on 4-month-long gambling vacations where all they do is gamble every single day. Something really does not add up here. But the math does begin to work a little bit better when we think about the purpose of losing money at a grander scale than what we might be thinking. And who else has employed this tactic before? So right now, let's just veer off the road onto the dirt path and begin discovering a little bit more of this for ourselves. Because what Steven is doing is not actually that uncommon. For the most of us, losing 400K is a loss of 400K. But for Steven, he's just spending 400 grand to make 5 million. Let me explain, because that does sound really dumb. This tactic is used by all sorts of criminals and people with questionable income streams to convert illegal cash, like drug money or blood money, or in our case, gun money, into squeaky clean cash. In fact, it's one of the oldest types of money laundering. And so now let's look at this from Steven Paddock's perspective. I'm walking into the casino with a giant chunk of cash that I can't spend anywhere because I got it illegally. But at a casino, they don't really ask questions, especially when I'm an ultra high roller preferred status member, and everyone at the casino knows me, and this casino knows that I'm the kind of guy who's gonna spend a bunch of money here and they can make money off of me. And from the casino's perspective, that's all true. Every time Steven walks in, they're making thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of dollars, so why wouldn't we let the guy back in? And also, who really cares where the money comes from is the perspective of most casinos. Indeed, just about every criminal organization you can think of has used this same tactic. So Steven walks up to the teller, gives him this giant hunk of cash, or engages in a wire transfer from an offshore bank account, and now this casino is going to take his money and return him what you would call chips, or virtual credits, or another internal currency used within the casino. And then Steven goes and plays the one machine consistently that he can count on to not generate any tax forms that would then bring questioning to him in the casino about what's been going on. It's low-key pretty brilliant. And at that point, we know that Steven, in the week prior to the shooting, had gambled roughly $160,000 at this one casino on the virtual slot machines. Indeed, it seems that almost all of his excess time was spent down on the casino floor, gambling and gambling away. And with that in mind, I think we can paint a much more clear picture of who Steven Paddock was, as all of his behaviors and life history align with that of a serious criminal. However, there is more to this point. After the gunfire settled and the FBI raided Steven's homes, they made an interesting discovery. The same homes that Steven was reported to never be staying at by his neighbors were filled with guns. The police discovered over 90 unique firearms. This wouldn't matter if you had a normal history, but clearly Steven doesn't. For our case though, there are 24 guns specifically that I care about, and that's the highest number I found listed for how many guns were in Steven's room. And alongside those 24 firearms were thousands of rounds of ammunition stacked up, ready to go. And the only people I know that would bring so many guns to a hotel that share a suspicious work history, including government contracting work, as well as military contracting work, are arms dealers and government operatives, which is interesting because that's nothing new for Las Vegas. It's known as a hub for arms trafficking as well as all sorts of other trafficking. And it's also interesting considering this affidavit that would later come out on the very topic of Stephen Paddock and his potential connections as an arms dealer. In this huge set of documents, there was a series of emails that Paddock had sent, talking what seems like a code for a lot of it, but there are parts where he speaks in just plain English. And on July 6th of 2017, Stephen sent the following email that completely proves the theory he was an arms trafficker. This email was in response to centralpark4804@gmail.com and centralpark1@live.com, the latter email being Stephen Paddock's. And it says the following, quote, "Try an AR before you buy. We have a huge selection located in the Las Vegas area. We have a wide variety of optics and ammunition to try. For a thrill, try out bump-fired ARs with hundreds of ammunition." There are actually more emails than this, but I think you get the point. So now that we know for a fact that Stephen Paddock was dealing arms, let's see what else we can try and pry apart here. At a casino like the Mandalay Bay, there is much higher security than normal. You are dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions, as well as a bunch of guests who are frankly intoxicated and are likely to lose a lot of money and burst at any moment. Meaning security and employees are generally always on guard. Thus, we have to reassess the narrative that we've been told from the media about how Paddock even got these weapons to his room. 24 is a lot of firearms to sneak anywhere, least of all a casino, and these weren't run-of-the-mill either. Indeed, each weapon was for the most part built off of either the AK-47 or AR-15 platform, which means they are a longer rifle with typically a 30-round capacity and a 16 to 18-inch barrel. And even more confusing is that these were super high-end versions of these weapons, with a price tag that police report was roughly in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, making them top of the line by far. Additionally, each gun was outfitted with a range of attachments, from long-range optics to vertical grips to bump stocks on at least a couple of them. All in all, each rifle weighed somewhere in the 10-pound range. So like any third grader, I did the basic math that apparently the mainstream media doesn't, and came to the quick conclusion that means Stephen's bags were filled with 240 pounds of guns. And these bags were often on the smaller end, which would have left a very obvious protrusion that was shaped like a gun, which should have gotten him stopped already. But in addition to that, there were also 5,500 plus rounds of ammunition with Stephen, which makes it more suspicious because that means Stephen's bags weighed an additional 200 pounds at minimum. And no one asked any questions? And that's excluding the cameras, computer, clothes, rangefinder, tools, and everything else he brought with him. And I've carried a lot of bags for work I've done in the past, and I noticed when something is a bit heavy, but 500 pounds for a single person's luggage? Are you kidding me? The bellboy didn't say to anyone that he thought it was strange, or notice, hey, that looks like a bunch of guns are in this guy's bag. Or since the crime scene photos show the ammo packed into metal military containers, he didn't hear the thousands of rounds of ammo jangling against one another? Yeah, no. But even worse is that these guns and ammo just sat out in the dude's room for 6 days. And while Stephen was around Vegas, no housekeeping walked in to clean and noticed the 20 guns hanging out everywhere, or the thousands of rounds of ammunition, and said, huh, that's a little odd. Nor the room service that we know delivered numerous orders to Stephen, likely bringing the room service cart into the room. No one? Seriously, no one noticed all these guns? Are you kidding me? It's interesting and impossible. Almost as impossible as the fact that the Mandalay Bay has never released any footage of the shooting, so we are left with basically no answers as to what exactly Stephen did for that week. We just know he did a lot of gambling. I couldn't tell you what else. So then we're going to be forced to fast forward all the way to October 1st of 2017. On that night, as we discussed, Stephen allegedly fired 1,100 bullets into the crowd before taking his own life. All in under 10 minutes, but this just isn't possible. Firstly, the math doesn't make sense. Stephen was a 64-year-old man, 32 stories in the air, and in some instances over 2,000 feet away from the targets he was firing at, which were moving. Yet according to the mainstream sources, around 58 people, like we discussed, were directly killed by his gunfire, and another 450 were injured by his gunfire. That would be ridiculous if he was just using a regular AR, but he was using one with a bump stock on it, allegedly, which allows a typical AR platform rifle to simulate automatic fire. But I have to say simulate because it's not only incredibly inaccurate, but incredibly prone to malfunction, especially if you're on the weaker side and can't handle the recoil of the gun, which Stephen was, being an old, fat, out-of-shape dude. The reason why the bump stock is so inaccurate is because the recoil that powers it causes the barrel to bounce up, down, left, right, all over the place, meaning at Stephen's range, it would have been impressive for him to have hit the broadside of a barn with that thing, let alone hit roughly 50% of his shots, while shooting at logic-defying speeds. In fact, this is so insane that if it was true, he'd be beyond the most excellent shot on earth. I would be willing to wager that not even your most well-trained, well-armed Green Beret at half that distance could do what is claimed that Stephen Paddock did on that night. And gosh, it's just so frustrating, but sometimes words fail to explain these things. So I'm going to show you guys a video instead that gives you a better idea of all the factors that would have gone into Stephen in shooting that night. This is a really good video. I recommend watching the whole thing. You can find it in the links below.
The bullet will then rise above the line of sight, creating the shape of a half circle as it meets the same impact point at a farther distance. This is known as bullet trajectory. After reaching the second zeroing point, gravity pulls the bullet from the line of sight. The rate at which a bullet drops over distance is caused by gravity and is a function of bullet speed. Gravity isn't the only thing affecting a bullet in flight. Drag, air resistance, and wind deflection are all factors in slowing down or pushing a bullet away from its target. Drag is determined by bullet speed, ballistic coefficient, and air density. It also increases when bullet speed relative to air increases. Wind will affect the vertical or horizontal component of the trajectory by causing deviation of the bullet's flight path. When the wind blows against a mountain, hill, or tall building, it generates a vertical component. Vertical wind can blow up or down, and the bullet will be deflected in that same direction. Because of these factors, long-range shooting can be extremely difficult to be precise.
I think that sums it up really well on how impossible this shooting was. Factoring for wind and distance and how relatively weak of a caliber Stephen was firing, that being .223, based on my best guess, he would have had to have been aiming upwards in order to get the bolt to go that far and then to land on people, which means he wasn't even looking at the targets he was shooting at, which makes this whole story one layer more impossible, because eyewitnesses from that night report hearing long streams of bullets upwards for minutes on end, non-stop, hitting all around them and sounding like they were coming from really close by. Which would be impossible for any of the guns that Stephen owned. And these accounts go directly against what the mainstream media told us about Stephen, which was that he was constantly switching between these 24 guns and switching windows, which is also stupid because it would just be faster to reload the same gun repeatedly. Thus, keeping that in mind and everything we've discussed, one does have to wonder if Stephen even fired a single round that evening. This is where things get really tricky, knowing Stephen's background and that in his room were a whole host of firearms. It's easy to assume that he was the shooter, but this can't be. For all the reasons mentioned before, but also because of this. According to the mainstream media, there was one shooter and the gunfire exited from the 32nd floor where Stephen was located. But eyewitness accounts that night tell us something very different. And in the case of the few people that spoke about it, something deadly different. Let's take a moment and read a brief account of a woman who was there that night. The entire account is really worth the read, also will be below. However, for our purposes, we're just going to read a bit, otherwise this video would go on for like an hour and a half. It wasn't ceasing, it wasn't slowing down, and it was directly behind us, following us. Bullets were coming from every direction, behind us, in front of us, to the side of us, but I just know that there was someone chasing us. The entire time I felt this way. The further we got from the venue, the closer the gunfire got. I kept looking back, expecting to see the gunmen, and I say men because there was more than one person. There was more than one gun firing, 100% more than one. And as we were running, we kept changing direction because it felt like no matter what direction we took, we were being followed. So we ended up running in a weird triangular path. The first place I remember getting to was a parking lot, and I told Cassie, who is slightly in front of me, we needed to get under one of the trucks. She turned to me and started her way back to me, and that is when the gunfire got even closer than before. It was right there. It was within the parking lot. Everyone around us was panicking once again, so we ditched the idea of getting underneath the vehicle, and we continued the run for our lives. If you know me, you know I'm a big girl who is out of shape, and who definitely does not run for any reason, but I can tell you I ran like I have never run before. The second place I remember going by was Hooters, which is where we met back up with the rest of our small group. We ran towards the entrance thinking we could take cover there, but as we got closer, a stampede of people ran out terrified. We can only conclude that there was another gunman inside of that hotel. The woman who posted this article is named Kimberly Schumel, and she made it to her Facebook account about 3 days after the incident. And alongside this post, to prove she was there, she uploaded several pictures of her and her friends at the Route 91 Harvest Festival, including a photo of the group in front of a sign that has the Harvest Festival logo on it. Therefore, because I don't believe in disparaging victims because their story is inconvenient, I'm going to decide to believe her here. And it's worth noting that Kimberly was one of many who would post publicly about her experiences with multiple shooters and her frustration that the media kept saying that it was only one. Unfortunately for us, however, Kimberly would be found by her mother around a week later in her bed, having died suddenly in her sleep. There was never never a real cause of death given, although some speculation has arisen. And that should be the biggest red flag to you imaginable, but it's gonna get worse. It seems that anyone who knew anything and went against the mainstream media narrative was at risk of being put onto the proverbial chopping block. And indeed, saying the term multiple shooters seems to have gotten you on a list of some sort. For instance, there was a man who was present at the shooting named John Beelman. After leaving the concert and making his trip back to New York, Beelman would receive a very strange visit from the FBI 2 days after the shooting. And then the following day of October the 4th, around 5:20 a.m., he took his disabled daughter outside along with his 12-gauge shotgun and ended both her life and his own right there in the backyard. No information has ever surfaced about why he did this or really what the FBI had come to his home for, but we can speculate for sure. But to that matter, I say just wait. Roy McLennan was another individual who was present for the shooting. He was incredibly heroic, getting his wife to safety and then bringing his truck back to help take people to the hospital and out of harm's way. Roy had intimate knowledge of the event and would have been one of those men who had the unique opportunity to see these multiple shooters directly. Less than 2 months later, Roy was hitchhiking home after leaving a friend's house early because they had gotten into an argument. Roy was supposed to be there helping his friend with a project. We don't have much details about what that project was specifically. However, we do know that it was around 1:33 a.m. when Roy was hitchhiking home, and shortly thereafter, while on a desolate stretch of highway, what is believed to have been a Camaro came flying around a bend and slammed right into Roy, but he didn't end his life there. The Camaro would speed away, leaving Roy to writher in pain on the ground until eventually he perished, alone in the darkness. His wife was angry and understandably so and began asking questions. However, it does seem that someone would not want her in Vegas or asking questions because Roy's wife would experience a house fire about 2 months later, which was the final straw eventually compelling her to leave Vegas. No charges were ever pressed in the incident with her husband and his demise, nor in the burning of the home. Indeed, there is actually very little information online about either. Once more, the couple Dennis and Lorraine Carver, who were present at the heart of the shooting, and also based on available evidence believe that multiple shooters had been present, survived the shooting. On that day, Dennis had gone so far as to lay on top of his wife, sacrificing himself to save her, before getting her up to run. And it worked. They both, through God's grace, made it out alive. However, it would appear that they were still on death's door. In here, I want to make a specific note that these two had 2 daughters who would report that they were just in love with life, had a new perspective on everything, were stopping this whole worry about the trivial things of the world, were loving each other and their daughters, and focusing on what really mattered. And so I'm sure that when they got in the car 2 weeks later, it was with love for one another and an excitement for the day. And yet this joy would be short-lived because not long after entering the vehicle, they would slam into the front gate of their community at such a high rate of speed that the car would explode into flames, melting the two alive inside. One of the 2 witnesses dying would be suspicious enough, but the couple who had been vocal about their experience dying simultaneously in the same bizarre car crash, I believe that about as much as I believe that the earth is flat, which is 0. And if matters simply could not get worse for this family, their 16-year-old daughter was the one who heard the crash and ran to the front of the neighborhood, only to watch her parents melt to death. And I don't think I need to reiterate how much this infuriates me that these people lost their lives, but it will continue. I'm not kidding. On the 21st of October, a man named Chad Nishimura was on his way to church just a few days after he gave an interview on KITV4 News, which is an affiliate station for ABC in Las Vegas. In the interview, Chad discusses, among many things, how he had been the one guy that had taken Stephen's bags up to his room, and then had stated he was a normal guy who didn't have many bags, which directly opposes the story that Paddock had taken over a dozen bags to his room, all of which were filled with guns that we talked about earlier. And this is a fact and a witness who then completely flips the narrative on the head and would require us to ask more questions. A few days after the interview was given, Chad's interview was erased from the KITV4 website, leaving us to only find it based on some archives, ironically one of which was generated by 4chan. And then this is where things are going to get really, really murky. It's also believed that all of Chad's social media disappeared within the same couple-day span, which as far as I can tell is true because I couldn't find any accounts of his. And then shortly after this period, Chad would eventually begin going back to church after a 2-week period where he wasn't. And when he arrived there that day at around 5:25 in the morning, he got out of his car only to be met with a bullet to the upper body as described by the police, and he would eventually bleed out. Now, we aren't certain on this last part because the disinformation campaign is insane on this topic, but we do know for a fact that Chad did give the interview that completely contradicts the media narrative. However, we do not know if he actually died or not, although I haven't been able to find any proof that he's alive, so it's up to you guys to believe whatever you like. I really could go on for longer because there are more suspicious deaths connected to this, but I'll finish with just this one, and that would be the death of Orville Allman Jr. Orville was a Nashville attorney present for the shooting. He was extremely involved in the music space and represented a variety of artists, including Jason Aldean, who was on stage when the shooting occurred. Even stranger, a variety of articles report on a conversation Orville had with a friend of his where he reported having met with MGM executives and the FBI and stated that the situation was very strange and complex. And shortly after giving this testament, Orville was found dead, having died once again like Kimberly, suddenly in his sleep. And it's worth reiterating that each of these victims are people who would have had a different perspective on the shooting, and it's reasonable to believe that they all would have known that there were multiple shooters, and as far as we can tell, they all reported on there being multiple shooters, at least according to various accounts. And in addition to that, they had access to information that others wouldn't, like Orville. No matter what though, each of these people's accounts of the events that day directly opposed the media narrative. Interestingly, Jason Aldean would do an interview roughly 7 years later after the shooting in which he says the following that I found very intriguing.
And then they were shooting, and I was just trying to get my pregnant wife somewhere and get her safe. Like, I had no idea where the guy was at. We thought he was on the ground backstage. So we thought he was, just backstage walking around mowing people down. That's what I thought. That's why I was like, get up, let's get on the bus and at least, get locked in there I got some stuff on the bus that will at least, even somewhat of an even playing field, pulls in the front of my bus and in the side. My band bus, the windows got shot out of the band bus. My bass player who was on stage to me, one of my best friends in the world for the last 25 years, was standing next to me, had a bullet lodged in the bass he was playing at the time. So bullet hits the bass he's got on at the time playing. And so, yeah, there was some close calls for that stuff.
I'm editing the video right now, and I just included that interview scene from Tucker Carlson with Jason Aldean, and I realized something really, really weird about what Jason said. The whole thing's weird in my mind, but specifically what I thought was particularly strange was the fact that his bass guitarist was on stage, he says, and yet the bullet, based on what Jason Aldean signals and seems to be suggesting, ended up in the front of the bass guitarist's guitar.
Bullet lodged in the bass he was playing at the time.
That doesn't make any sense because the Mandalay Bay doesn't face the stage. The Mandalay Bay is actually back a little bit to the left side of the stage is what I guess it would be. So that only makes me further suspicious and would go to prove that there was more than one shooter, which also Jason sort of suggests because he initially thought that there was a shooter near him on the ground. In fact, he subtly references that him and his whole team had guns in the RV that they take to shows, and were going to use that to fight back if they had to. So something really weird is going on here. Even the guy who's on stage doesn't really seem to believe the story of what we're told. Just something I thought I'd add in there. Let's get back to the story. All of this really does make one wonder how this could have occurred, but before we get into the multiple shooters theory, which is probably gonna have to be in the next video, we first need to look somewhere else to better understand the context of the situation. With everyone who went public with multiple shooters theory, or would have had some advanced knowledge that other concert goers didn't, we now are placed in a position where it's impossible to believe the media narrative. So therefore, let's continue and try and find anything else that we can about this situation to give it more context, which is difficult because outside of these witnesses, no one else has come forward to talk about this side of the topic. And it seems logical why not. Anyone can surmise that it's pretty adverse for your health to speak about this. And moreover, the FBI allegedly confiscated and buried most of the footage from that night. Now, I cannot necessarily confirm those reports, so it's not the hill I choose to die on, but we do know that the FBI seized all the footage from the surrounding casinos, hotels, resorts, restaurants, you name it, and still to this day is the only one who has possession of those images, meaning that reports are murky at best and video evidence is nil, which makes identifying the shooter extremely difficult. Think about this, no one actually saw Paddock fire a single shot in anger, nor did they ever really see bullets coming from the 32nd floor of that hotel, which should raise all sorts of red flags, but there is one exception to what I have just told you, and that is a man named Jesus Campos, who has a very interesting story, or as we'll find out, stories to tell. On the night of October the 1st of 2017, Jesus Campos reported initially that he had led the police up to Stephen Paddock's room and had heroically taken a bullet to the leg in the process. And yet, this can't be true. As is thematic in this case, Jesus Campos and the police would repeatedly change their story, which they did in this instance. Jesus Campos originally reported taking a bullet around 10:18 p.m., which at the time is when the police reported the shooting had begun. However, shortly after this, the police then changed the shooting timeline back by about 13 minutes to 10:05. So now Campos is caught in a lie. But no one ever presses him on this. Campos realizes this and then changes his story to state that he had actually gone up to check on a door that was left open at 9:59 p.m., which would then have been 6 minutes before the shooting, and at that time he had taken the bullet. This too is incredibly strange because clearly this guy is lying, but it's even stranger because Jesus made a call to the security office at that time, but on it he was incredibly calm and mentioned nothing of a shooter nor taking a bullet to the leg, which one would think would be the critical information you give after having been shot by someone who's engaged in a mass shooting. Moreover, the fact that he had called down at 9:59 p.m. to report on this door means that he had known of Stephen Paddock 6 minutes before he had begun shooting and could have easily gotten the police up there to stop the events that would later occur. This too is not where it ends. From what I can tell, the final narrative that Jesus ended up on was that he was called to the 32nd floor because a fire door had been barred shut, which officials would later presume was Paddock's work, and that when he went up there, he called it into the security office and was walking back down, at which point bullets began ripping through Stephen Paddock's door, with one striking Campos in the leg. This, however, is impossible for 1,000 reasons, one being that the camera setup that Stephen had acquired, which we'll get into in the following episode, would not have allowed him to see Jesus Campos down the hallway. In addition to that, what we are told is that Stephen Paddock was firing .223, which is an AR caliber, but a weaker version that cannot punch through thick wooden doors in a casino and then travel down a hallway fast enough to strike a security guard. On top of this, Jesus then paints himself as a hero, telling one of his colleagues to get out of the way when he walks up the stairs, as well as telling a woman to get back into her hotel room when she looks out. All of which obviously didn't happen, according to the report he made that night, where he mentions nothing of the shooter nor anything suspicious besides this closed door that was apparently not even barred shut like was later reported. Also begs the question of, if there are people on this 32nd floor, why did none of them call it in? But hey, what do I know? So with all these different stories that leave you and I confused, what actually happened? And if this security guard is a serial liar changing his story every 5 seconds, do we even know who was there shooting that night? And do we even know what actually happened? And the answer simply is no, we don't. But one thing is for certain, Jesus Campos cannot be trusted whatsoever. Now, I know there's going to be a minority of you who think that I'm extreme in saying that we cannot trust Jesus. After all, maybe it's just the adrenaline that caused him to change his story. Okay, you know what? I'll play ball with you. I disagree, but let's do it anyway. This isn't the only thing Jesus Campos would lie about. In fact, we're not even sure Jesus Campos actually existed. So I know once again that sounds crazy, but let's dive into it. Jesus Campos isn't actually a security guard. Or at the very least, he isn't listed on the security guard database for Nevada. Fun fact, it's required for every security guard in Vegas casinos to have a specific license that ensures they have the proper training. And searching for Jesus Campos in this database in the days after the shooting would show you that Jesus Campos isn't anywhere on that database. There are several Camposes, including Larry Jesus Campos. However, if we look at the profile picture on the Facebook after doing some sleuthing, we can see that this is most certainly not the same Jesus Campos that would later encounter Stephen Paddock. Moreover, we can be certain that Jesus Campos is his name because it's the only one ever used on any media source that I found, both mainstream to more independent. No one else calls him by anything else. So now we know Jesus was lying about his story about encountering Paddock, as well as being shot, and likely even lying about being a security guard. Thus, at this juncture, we can trust him just about as much as we can trust any of the last 5 presidents along with a child. But it does get stranger. Right after the incident, Jesus scheduled himself on dozens of interviews with both television and written media publications, wanting to tell his story. However, just before going on these, he leaves the country to go visit his family in Mexico, literally not even bothering to tell these people that he wasn't going to be there. He just didn't show up. And this is another issue. Not only is it weird that he didn't come to the interviews, he says that he took a road trip by himself to go see his family. Yeah, that's a 700-mile drive from where he lives in Nevada to Mexico, where his parents are. And we're led to believe that the man who just took a bullet to the leg, his accelerator leg no less, was able to drive 700 miles on it? No. And then after this, there's about a week with 0 word from Jesus. No one knew where the man went. But thankfully, upon return, he would come out and speak to the masses on the Ellen DeGeneres show, where he changes his story once again. And this interview is weird for 1,000 reasons. I'm going to play a couple clips of it. However, what's most strange about the interview is that Ellen DeGeneres goes on to tell her audience that this is the only interview that Jesus will ever do. He doesn't want to have to relive the moment ever again, so he's never going to talk about it except for right now on this show.
I know, first of all, thank you so much for being here. And I know that you have had so many people asking for you to tell the story and to talk about this. And I understand your reluctance because you just want this to be over. So you're talking about it now and then you're not going to talk about it again. And I don't blame you because why relive this over and over again? But it's helpful for people to understand what a hero you are, because you being shot in the leg saved so many people's lives.
And Jesus, to his credit, has stayed true to that statement. Try as you will, the man was never heard from or seen again. Indeed, he seems to have disappeared right off the face of the earth. It's as though he got up off that couch, walked out of the studio, and entered into a portal into a different dimension. It's really odd and disconcerting. And this rabbit hole does get weirder about Jesus. Something just isn't quite right. But as stated, we never hear from Jesus again. His brother, however, Luis Castro, has a different story to tell. It's a long one, so for the sake of the length of the video, which is already getting long, I'm just going to summarize it here for you guys. In his story, Luis says that MGM, the company that owns the Mandalay Bay Hotel, had paid for Jesus' trip down to see his family in Mexico, and then had flown him back to be on the Ellen Show, which is already a little odd. Luis then states that the Ellen interview was staged, the cane is fake, and Jesus is reading from a teleprompter, which watching the interview, all those things seem very plausible. But it's what Luis follows up with that makes this so strange. He tells us that his brother was angry after the shooting, stating that all he was going to get was basic workers' comp after being shot. Luis states that he's not surprised that's all he was going to get because the injury was so minor you wouldn't know it was a bullet wound unless he told you. Luis then tells us that Jesus went and met with MGM executives and came out with a seemingly great deal. But it certainly changed Jesus from who he used to be. Luis says that his brother-in-law, whom he'd known for 11 years and had even lived with him at certain points, was way different. MGM held him for weeks in a property called the Vedra, which is a luxury hotel in Vegas they own. And Jesus was there under guard, not really allowed to leave, but allowed to have people visit under supervision. And so Jesus invited his family to come stay with him for a while. They got 3 free rooms and everything was complimentary. Luis says that everything from then on for Jesus was comped. He didn't work anymore, but always had money, and MGM executives were leaving Jesus letters in giant food trays. This is already a dozen sets of red flags, however, Luis continues for a while, discussing how Jesus was made to sign an NDA by MGM that practically gave the guy a full all expenses paid life, so long as he shut up and did not talk about a single thing he saw that night. And to top this off, MGM gave Jesus Campos 2 condos to live in and seemingly a lifetime trickle of cash to live off of. And Luis was, incidentally, smart enough to get some photos of what he saw, including a selfie of him and his former brother-in-law hanging out at the Vedra Hotel, which they could not afford, being poor themselves, along with a letter from an executive and the key cards for his room. He makes a compelling argument and manages to back it up fairly well, considering he didn't know he was going to ever have to use this to prove what had happened. And because of this, we get a lot more color on who Jesus was and why we haven't heard from him since that day. Indeed, we aren't the first to ask this question though, as there is a Vegas attorney who also was intrigued by the behavior MGM displayed towards the star witness of this entire thing. Her name is Catherine Lombardo, and she states that MGM rushed Jesus into hiding, bought his silence, and used the Ellen Show as a stunt. She's a dog too, and not one you'd want to mess with, and is a very well-respected attorney, specifically involved in the Vegas case for the sake of getting the victims a payout.
It was a publicity stunt, try to get their good PR back, right? They're trying to get themselves to look good again. Let's present him as a hero. Let's tell Ellen what to ask. Let's tell him what to say to make him look like a hero. And it was offensive to the 22,000 people that were there. To this day, he's gone underground. No one else has been able to contact him, find him. MGM had him sequestered in a property that they own. One of our investigators went to his house, and there is a security guard, plain clothes, parked outside of his house in a car, just an unmarked car, that is most likely employed by MGM, who hopped out quickly and cut her off at the path and said, whoa, whoa, you know, what do you need? Can I help you? No, you can't knock on that door. No, you can't go in. No, he's not here. So they're holding him. So the whole thing is a sham.
She's saying the quiet part out loud, that's for sure, and her whole job is to seek restitution for victims, which makes me think that, once again, we aren't being told the truth. The little trail that we do have outside of this shows that the company Jesus was allegedly contracted from doesn't really exist. An investigator went to their offices and found them empty, while at the same time found their phone lines to be unresponsive. And when I tell you this is about the most tame we're gonna get in this story, I really mean it. I don't know why I expect to be able to make this all in one video, but I hope you guys enjoyed part 1 of this series, because this is gonna get really crazy from here on out. If you made it this far, I really do hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. I plan on doing the full series explaining everything wrong with the story as we're told. And like I said, this really is just the beginning, you guys. It's gonna get a lot weirder from here. And when we start getting into the people who are involved, there's gonna be a lot of questions that we need to ask. Like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for all the extra support that's been happening on the channel. For 50,000 subscribers, that's such a mind-blowing number. Thank you for everyone on the Patreon who's been carrying, especially Paul, who just goes above and beyond over there. It really does mean the world. Thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you for watching the video, liking, for following the Instagram. Make sure to check out the Minecraft server. I have a ton of fun seeing all you guys on there and playing whenever I can get a chance to get on there. And yeah, I think that's about everything. That being said, you guys, let me know your thoughts on the video. I look forward to seeing each and every one of you in the next one.